Good afternoon again. Uh, I would like to welcome you to the Observer Research Foundation for this National Security Dialogue. We have a series, and as part of the series, today we are going to discuss the US India defense cooperation, which, of course, I'm sure all of you know is we are going to look at its trajectory and prospects. And I have with me four speakers. Brigadier Arun Segal, who's right next to me, Director, Forum of Strategic Studies in New Delhi. Samir Lalwani, I think he's around somewhere, but he'll be on the screen because he'll be talking from the US. He's an senior expert in South Asia and at the US Institute for Peace. Manu Pabbi, senior editor, Economic Times, New Delhi. Akriti Vasudeva, who's on the screen right there. She's this fellow of South Asia at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And Shruti Pandalai on my right, who's a fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. So we plan to have the discussion till about 5 o'clock. So as you will see that given we will have a pretty tight kind of a schedule for the speakers, because if you keep your presentations tight, we'll be able to have more discussion. By way of opening remarks, what I'd like to point out is that this trajectory that we speak of actually goes back all the way to 1962, because the first time US-India defense cooperation began was in the wake of the 1962 war. But at various points in time, this had its ups and downs. So in 62, the US promised us $500 million aid, but 65 war embargo came and that was the end of that. Then again, in 1980, 81, when Indira Gandhi came back to power, one thing she realized was that she needed to befriend the US. And so she had a famous meeting with Ronald Reagan in Cancun. And thereafter, an Indo-US MOU on tech transfer was signed in December of 1984. This is just after Indira Gandhi passed away and Rajiv Gandhi took power as the prime minister. So this Indo-US MOU on tech transfer is the first time. Basically, what had happened was that in the 80s, when India started, when Indira Gandhi came back to office, she realized that there had been too much dependence on the erstwhile Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had just invaded Afghanistan. Though India did not say anything about the Afghanistan thing, it did not criticize the Soviet Union, but it realized that it needed to distance itself. But the Soviet Union, as a result of which, the Soviet Union became quite desperate, and they came to us and they said, we will offer you our latest weapon systems. So the whole phase of rearmament in the 1980s, the Indian Army rearmament in 1980s, was with Soviet weapons, T-72 tanks, big 29 aircraft. So what the US decided as a matter of strategy was that they could not match the Soviet Union for prices. Soviet Union had no concept of prices, and they could give it any. So what the Americans decided as a matter of strategy was that they would help India to, on the technological front, to become self-reliant. So one of the first projects that they focused on was the LCA project. So they offered the engine, which was at that time a frontline engine, G404 engine for the LCA, and that powered that particular so since then 404 has been powering the LCA. Other subsystems also they said they would make, but the 1998 embargo sort of put an end to that. So then, it has been a steady growth since then. The Bush presidency, when there was a recognition in America that India was needed from a strategic point of view. Actually, the big shift occurred after Tiananmen. With the Tiananmen event happened in Beijing, the United States decided that there were limits to what it could do with China. Till then, China and the United States had a quasi alliance. They had a quasi alliance, and so that shift occurred at that particular point in time. And but the point is that in practical terms, it happened much more slowly. So you have, I'll just read out, 2002, we signed the first of the foundational agreements, the General Security of Military Information Agreement. In 2003, 2004, we began the first set of exercises with the United States. Basically, the Vajra Prahar, SF Special Forces exercise, Yuddha Abhyas, COPE India. Though, of course, we had started the Malabar exercise in 1991. That's a naval exercise. These others were Army and Air Force exercises. But, I want to cut short my introductory remarks. I'd just like to say that the big event, big period for the Indo-US identifying the trajectory of the relationship was really 2023. That's last year. Because, in between we had tried lots of things. Defense, trade and technology initiative. We tried to develop technology, it didn't work. And so then in 2023, in 2022, actually it was announced, but 2023 it became operational. The Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies was announced. In May 2023, the Advanced Domain Dialogue, which took up all the advanced domains, like AI and things, were taken up. The G414 engine deal was announced. This was the successor to the 404, but this engine is what we are going to manufacture. Then the bilateral defense acceleration ecosystem, INDUS-X, was created. So we have now come to this point, but now will it succeed or not succeed? Even that, there is no real guarantee. Remember one thing, US has the most advanced technology, and the US guards it extremely jealously. No matter what exemptions are given, etc., but those exemptions always are conditional, in the sense that you still have to get licensed. It has to be licensed with the United States. The real inside track with the US comes if you are part of the US national technology industrial base. Now, only countries like Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, these are the only countries which are part of the US NTIB. So for us, you can say that we have had a successful trajectory on the technology front if we become part of the NTIB. But I don't foresee that in the near future. So in the near future, we will be dependent on licensing, we'll be dependent on exemptions, and the US will remain extremely jealous of its technology. What NSA Sullivan said was a small yard with a big fence. So US is tightening controls even further in that area. So even though we have come a long way, but still one should not take for granted some of these things. So I will just end my opening remarks out here, and I will request Brigadier Sehgal to make his introductory remarks. I would suggest that you keep it about 10, 12 minutes.
Yeah. So,
and then we can, because that will enable us to have a reasonable discussion. Thank you, Brigadier Sehgal.
thank you very much, Manoj, for this opportunity. It's great to be back at ORF after so many years. I'll cover my remarks in two parts. I'll first look at what is driving the Indo-US Defense Cooperation. And the second part, I will look at the technology cooperation. I mean, that's the more important part, but the drivers of Indo-US Defense Cooperation are equally important. The centrality of the China challenge is a given. I mean, that's the basic issue. But here again, I want to highlight this, that we and Americans don't look at China the same way. We have a different perspectives. For United States, China is a peer competitor. The greatest challenge that they have globally, which is challenging its unipolarity and is challenging its entire uh, uh, status in the global system. And China, with partnership with Russia, is posing a incremental challenge to the American power and influence. From our perspective, we look at China as a regional player who is trying to dominate us, challenge us in various domains, and yet we do not look at China as an adversary of. It's a consequential power, but not really seen as an adversary whom we have to challenge right through. So we have to, from our Indian perspective, management of the Chinese is an important aspect of our relationship. So these two things are the differential that we need to take cognizance of, because because this provides a different perceptions when the Americans talk about India, and when we look at China as a central focus point in our relationship, and we look at China as the centrality. The second point is uh, it is the emergence of Indian comprehensive national power and influence. That's an important aspect. When you look at Asia, or whatever you want to call it, Indo-Pacific, the fundamental point you have to understand is this: apart from the centrality of the American and the Chinese power, there is only another player in the region that has got a comprehensive power. That is military, technological, economic power, and backed by 1.4 billion population, huge markets. So this is an important aspect that endears the Americans to have a good relationship with India. Please also note the fact, as when you look at the American influence in Indo-Pacific, there are two aspects to the Indo-Pacific we need to take cognizance of. There is an Eastern Asia where entire the entire alliance system of United States operates. The collective security mechanism which are being put in place through Biden administration are there. They comprise of South Korea, Republic of Korea, they apply of Japan, they apply of Australia, and now increasingly Philippines. That's where the AUKUS program is. There is also the technological cooperation program is, which recently led to the Tomahawk, long-range Tomahawk being tested. That is the core point, and that core point relates to the security of the first island chain. That's one aspect. In between, there is a buffer, and that buffer is South China Sea. The South China Sea buffer is being penetrated, but being contested at the shoals of the Philippines. Beyond that is the Indian Ocean region. And from Indian perspective, there is no American heft in the Indian Ocean region. This is something which we must understand. There is no American power or influence in the Indian Ocean region. There are commitments. So when we look at the Indo-Pacific security architecture, it can be divided into three parts, but none of those parts are integrated. Okay? Now, one of the reasons that Americans are pushing for and are keen to bring India up to speed in terms of its capacity building, military capacity building, is to give India sufficient capacities and power to deal with the Chinese challenge or the other challenges that come about in the Indian Ocean region entering into the South China Sea. Please also note why this is important is that today Chinese is an 18 trillion economy. Another 5 years or 10 years, 7 years down the line, it will be a 22, 23 trillion dollar economy. Huge trade is going to pass through this region. And that's one of the reasons why the Chinese are building up bases and places in the Indian Ocean region. And I'm sure you've been following the fact is that how the Chinese have been asking for Gwadar as a military base is something which we had said. In fact, I have written about this about 6 to 8 months back. How the first overseas command of the Chinese PLA Navy is going to come up somewhere around Gwadar. The in return, they are asking for a second strike capability, nuclear second strike capability, which, gentlemen, is or ladies, is a euphemism for a nuclear submarines. So, I've been in about 13 long years with a nuclear dialogue with the Pakistanis, so we understand what they are talking about on these issues. But this is the important point we are doing. There are some constraint in Indo-US relationship. So there are a lot of they are building up our strength. We are looking at them. We are also interested in building up our capacities, but there are certain constraints. The constraints are, number one, like I said, the foci of the American power, influence, and application of military power is far away from India. Two, when they look at India, and if you read Ashley Tellis's pieces and his articles and some of his other people, they are all focusing upon what role India can play in a Taiwan contingency. You will have not read an article as to what is the primary role America can play in an Indo-centric contingency, be it on land or at sea. This is an important aspect. So this is one issue which is of concern to us. The second issue of concern to us is that recently we are seeing some attempts being made by some elements within the US administration to upstage us in our backyard. Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar to a degree also. So there is our differences and perceptions which are building up over here. We have to deal with these issues. We have to deal with these perspectives which are coming up, and we are cognizant of that. Nobody gives $1.2 billion aid to Bangladesh for what? And until yesterday, Bangladesh was not even being talked to before 15th of August this year. So the issue that we need to look at is the third element is this, that we have been pushing very hard, the Americans, to provide some kind of credibility to the Indian Ocean regional security architecture. In my last meeting in DC, when we were there, one of the very senior ex-defense secretary, he mentioned the fact is that the America should look at reconciling its boundaries of its command. The Pacific Command is too limited for India's perspective, so they were looking at creating a Mediterranean command by combining the Central Command as well as the South Asia, Africa Command, and making it a Mediterranean command. I presume some work on this issue could happen during the Trump administration because they are really serious. But if you also want to understand how the dynamic is being played up in Pentagon and in American administration at this point in time is in last 15 to 20 days, 3 aircraft carriers have sailed into the Indo-Pacific, and they are right now deployed in East Asia in relation to what is happening in Taiwan right now. So the short point to be made is we are partners, we are Quad partners, but I don't look at Quad as a 4.4 country government. I look at it as 3+1. 3 are allies, 1 is an independent player who's a strategic partner. The concept of strategic partner is still not permeated deep inside the American administration. I'll stop at this point. Now I'll come to Defense Technology Cooperation. Defense Technology Cooperation is the cornerstone. We must admit this is one of the major efforts done by the Biden administration to shift the focus of Indo-US defense cooperation from purely defense orientation to technology cooperation. The 74-page joint statement, which was issued after 2023 visit by the Prime Minister, is all-encompassing. It covers everything that we want to know. It indicates the desire of the Biden administration to integrate India as an important player into the American-led supply chain, defense supply chain, and provide its the capacities and capabilities. That was followed up, like the chair said just now, with ISET program, and then that's a defense innovation program. But the issue basically is this: there are a huge amount of what we call regulatory mechanism and perceptual differences. The perceptual differences are, while the executive is very keen, legislator sometimes plays footsie, and the State Department, I'm afraid, is not the keenest or the best of player for India. We have to recognize this fact. The difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration was and continues to be till 20th of January, I presume, is that in the Trump administration, the Pentagon was the driver of this relationship. But this administration is the State Department is the driver. So it comes with all the baggage of the State Department, democracy, liberals, and all those issues that come into play, and those define the parameters of this relationship. So what is the status now? The status is 404 is a genuine case. Please do not blame the Americans for this, because the South Korean firm tanked up, and they are trying to put together a new supply chain. I think by April, May next year, we should start getting the engines which are required. 414 was enormous work. Again, difference in perceptions. India believes that having signed the MOU and sat down and worked with them on some SOPs and papers, the work is done. No. When it comes to each and every element which is IPR related, it becomes a very serious question of how we want to manage it. See, when you are going to put together a 414 production chain, it's not this thing. It's not a technology. This thing is a production chain is being brought from United States, and 80% set up in India, with where the 80% work of the production chain will be done in India. 20% will continue to be there. There is no sharing of IPR with you on this thing. So, and also please remember, it's just a 95 kilonewton engine, which is enough to power a fourth generation plus fighter. It's not a fifth generation fighter. So it's good for us that because Tejas Mark II will get flying, but AMCA and other elements that we have in mind will not get any of those tractions. Similarly, another element is that MH177 howitzer, which we bought from this thing, we have given up on that deal. We are not going to produce them in India. Similarly, Striker, we went to town with it, but we are not going to produce Striker in India because Striker is not the kind of technology that is needed by us. We are moving into a number of other areas. Predators, for example, we are buying, we get 80%. What does the 80% mean? 80% means the MROs. 80% means some critical items will be provided through India, through SMEs. That's the kind of issue that will come up. And that's what is going to happen. But also I like to highlight is in my, just closing my, just 2 minutes after is that it's not always the Americans that are at fault or any other countries at fault. Our own IDMM, our programs, acquisition programs need to be looked into a little more in detail. For example, IDMM. IDMM allows only 49% foreign participation. Even in the production where you have 74% participation, the question is you have to look through the entire supply chain. He has an Indian partner. The 74%, sorry, we'll get an Indian partner. But how do you manage the supply chain? Where are the items going to come about? How will the foreign vendor manipulate his chain when your requirements of those items is 150, 200, 300? So what we have to understand is that every time you're talking about Atam Nirbhar in India, you have to take cognizance of the fact Atam Nirbhar has to be Atam Nirbhar plus export. Without export, things will not work. Nobody is going to put up $10 billion factories into India without any export element. What is happening in SOSA and other elements that we are talking about, they have identified 15 different industries from who will provide items to the Americans. But right now we have a problem. We have a problem because SOSA is not the end game. There are two, three other foundational, not really, but there are regulatory mechanisms which will have to become. I can give you the name. It doesn't really matter, but those have to be overcome before Indian companies can apply for tenders in the United States or supply them items over there. So all I will say is that it's not that the Americans are going slow. Just remember the ITR clearance for AUKUS was given only last year or this year. It was given this year in June. It was given this year in June. Took 3 years for ITR clearance. ITR is International Trade and Armament Register, which is imperative to transfer any armament-oriented equipment. So it's not going to be easy. It's a work in progress. But the success of 414, to me, is an indicative of deep American commitment to work together with India. I'm not saying help India. No, we don't need anybody's help. To work together with India of establishing credible supply chains as part and parcel of a joint Indo-Pacific global partnership with the United States. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Brigadier. I'll now request Samir Lalwani to speak to us from the United States.
Great. Well, thank you, Manoj, and good to be with you all. Early morning for me, but I enjoyed the conversation thus far. I'll actually keep my remarks pretty brief. Let me say just 3 general things, and I'm sure we can get into more discussion in Q&A. So the first is that I think we've seen an enormous amount of continuity and growth in the U.S.-India defense relationship over the last 20 years, not just the last 4. And the last 4 have built upon the shoulders of previous administrations. And this is, I don't think we need to continue to repeat this, but this has been a bipartisan supported effort within the U.S. It's been built upon and like layers of innovations have been built upon within different administrations in the United States. So, for example, you have this Defense Policy Group, which has been sort of one of the lead structures within the U.S.-India defense framework. And layered upon that, I think, was an innovation in the Trump administration of the 2+2 dialogue, which was able to fuse defense and foreign affairs together, because oftentimes these things are interdependent. There's not just it's not just defense on its own. There's geopolitics that sort of comes along with it. So I think that 2+2 framework was a real innovation in the Trump administration that the Biden administration has built upon, and I expect it to continue to develop even further. Similarly, there's references to Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, DTTI, and frankly, I understand that there's a lot of disappointment about sort of what DTTI delivered. I should also point out that it's still going, and there's actually still the air-launched UAV program between DRDO and AFRL are still continuing, making progress. And they recently did a test in India in, I believe, October. So progress is being made. But, the point is that ISET and INDEX could not have been developed without the learning curve of DTTI. I think in any sort of innovation structure, you have to fail a few times before you can sort of innovate to the next level. And it's better to fail fast and move on to 2.0 or 3.0.
So the third point is that, the other sort of forms of continuity and development, obviously the Quad was, again, something that was resurrected by the Trump administration and developed by the Biden administration, advanced to the head of state level. And then in our areas of military interoperability, we've got a lot of developments in exercises, but also new elements within the military exercises we've conducted. Malabar is obviously a flagship for countries that happen to be in the Quad and participate in it. But the Sea Dragon underwater domain awareness or underwater ASW exercise, I think, is another innovation that came out of the Trump administration in 2020 and has continued in the Biden administration. Also, very focused on the underwater threat and challenges that we'll mutually face. And then you're seeing a lot more work in the space domain. So India's recently become a party to the Global Sentinel exercise. The Advanced Domain Dialogue or Advanced Defense Domain Dialogue also resulted in an exercise, and I expect more of that to continue in the future. So, point being, enormous continuity, but also enormous growth, and we should expect to see that going forward. Second big point, and I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time on this, is we owe a lot of this to China. So thank you, Beijing, and thank you, Xi Jinping. There's been sort of a streak of coercive, aggressive, and deceptive behavior by China over the last decade plus. It's certainly intensified in 2020 on the India-China border, but has continued ever since in South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, in our cyber networks, in the way in which sort of global trade networks have been occasionally pressured and coerced by sort of Chinese coercion within its supply chain. So I think that is pressing us to make harder choices in our collaboration. There are obviously domestic equities at play in every technology choice. I think technology innovation really stems from overcoming some domestic pushback that is inevitable. There are established equities in different sectors that will always resist changes in organization or new innovations that displace older companies for newer companies. But when sufficiently motivated or sufficiently threatened, as I think we both are, I think we're willing to sort of make those innovations. So China's been a critical driver of this, and I would expect, I believe that most of Washington expects China's behavior to not abate in terms of the pressure it's putting on whether adversaries or challengers or other competitors. The third point, I think maybe is I'll echo something that Brigadier Sehgal talked about, and that is sort of as we look forward, what are the opportunities for growth? And I'm sure you'll have a lot of feedback on sort of what can happen within the U.S. system, and we can certainly talk about that. But let me identify three things within the Indian system that I see as opportunities for India to make some clearer choices, and in doing so, I would expect to see even greater defense technology cooperation and innovation between our two countries. So the first is something that I think both Manoj and Brigadier Sehgal referred to, which is that India can make certain choices to deepen its cooperation with the U.S. deterrence network, the U.S. sort of coalition of deterrence. I think that the current administration refers to this as integrated deterrence. This is not just allies, it's also a lot of partners with the United States. But the objective here in all of our enterprises in the defense domain is to build deterrence effects. That means on a daily basis, deterring our adversaries from taking actions inimical to our sovereign interests. And those are embedded through intelligence sharing, they're embedded through exercises, they're embedded through day-to-day operations. And so the more that India is willing to lean into collaborative ventures that have operational effects and deterrence effects, the more you'll see the technological door open. And I think we've seen this over the last 4 years. As India has stepped up its willingness in the Indian Ocean to take certain responsibilities and certain burdens on, I think you've seen simultaneous forward movement in ISET and INDUS-X. So the positive signs I see on the horizon are India's joining of the combined maritime force, something that I thought was impossible a few years ago. And so moving from an associate partner to a full partner, and my understanding is next year potentially even leading a task force. I think those are huge strides, and huge strides that have appealed to not just the U.S. Pentagon, but an incoming administration that has put an emphasis on reciprocity. Reciprocity in multiple domains. And so in the defense domain, the more India leans into this, I expect to see even sort of more doors open in technology cooperation. Certainly in domains like space, we've talked about with the 83 dialogue and tabletop exercises, as India commits more to taking on responsibilities in space or sharing commercial assets in space. I think Space Force is a keen party to this. You'll see more opportunities for technology cooperation or technology sharing, and similarly in the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness initiative, you'll start to see as India takes on sort of greater burden sharing in the information space, both in terms of information collection and then sharing. I expect more doors to open. The second element of sort of opportunity for growth is actually within India, which is a fight between its public and private sectors. I think we all sort of know this. There have been numerous reports about potential reforms in the offing. Maybe those reforms are coming down the pike. Maybe they have stalled. But for a long time, India has relied heavily on its public sector. And it's obvious that it's not going to abandon that public sector defense enterprise. It's not going to go away anytime soon. But as it wants to cooperate more with the West and US companies, we're talking about working more in the private sector. So the degree to which India elevates its private sector through investments, through prioritization, through technology release, and through enabling the private sector to control their own technology and their own destiny rather than being requisitioned by the public sector, the more you're going to see deeper collaborations. And you're seeing this, I think, in the INDUSX framework, which is where I'm closest to. You see a lot of US companies building partnerships with Indian startups and collaboratively developing their technologies to prototypes, to field testing, and hopefully to production. And that production is not just for the US and Indian markets, but it's also for export. There's a real opportunity for US companies to see export potential when you're producing and making in India. And I think you're seeing a lot of companies coming to that conclusion. But yeah, I think the elephant in the room is going to be DRDO reform and what flexibility is given to the private sector. And similarly, even in India's private sector, are the big conglomerates going to invest in R&D and innovation, or are they going to just simply be production, assembly, and wait for contracts? Because I think I see at the startup level a lot of Indian companies really investing in innovation and new developments, but they're looking for mentorship, and they're looking for technology development partners. And it seems that there'll be a lot of U.S. companies interested in that, but hopefully I think the Indian conglomerates and big business houses will get involved in that as well. The third area that I think India sort of needs to work through is choices when it comes to joint production versus high technology sharing and transfer. And these are not obviously at odds with each other, but it does sort of lead to different focus on different types of projects, right? So there's always been two demand signals from India: joint production, but also joint innovation. And to some degree, these are different domains. Joint production is really maybe a lower margin but higher volume business enterprise, which means you're creating a large number of blue collar jobs, which is great, but you're not necessarily sort of moving up the value chain or leading to technology transfers. On the other end, you have high technology collaboration, which means maybe a smaller number of white collar jobs, but it's a higher margin, even if it's done in lower volume. And I think at times, India trips itself up in wanting both of these things at the same time from the same project. And I think being clearer about what projects are about technology developments and what projects are about production for greater work share, which leads to greater employment, having clarity about that going into these projects will help with seeing them through. Because if at the 11th hour you have a joint production deal where you say, wait, hold on, where's the technology transfer process? Well, that was never baked into it or was never sort of intended to be a part of it. And similarly, when you have a technology co-development process, but there's not a huge work share because most R&D is not going to be sort of large volume blue collar work. You can sort of run aground in these collaborations if you're not clear-eyed about what the objective is. I think both tracks can work together, but they're not necessarily on the same project. So being clear about that, I think, will ensure that we don't have sort of late stage snafus that derail various types of technology collaboration. I do think that joint production will lead to latent knowledge transfer. Really, we're not going to get to a point of knowledge transfer without learning by doing and doing things together. And so there, for example, I see things like the IDEX and DIU joint challenges that are being issued, most recent one in the space domain that was recently highlighted by, I think, Ambassador Quatra and Deputy NSA Feiner in their recent meeting. But those joint challenges are opportunities for companies to innovate together at an early stage, but then eventually, hopefully, build out to prototypes and production over the long term. So I've talked a lot, but I'd say, to wrap up those 3 points, I think we have enormous continuing growth. It's largely driven by Chinese behavior, which I don't expect to change. And I think there's ample opportunity for India to make some choices and some tough ones over the next few years that I think can intensify this cooperation even more, both operationally as well as technologically. Thank you.
Samir, for that presentation. I think it's extremely useful. Now, I'd request Manu Pabbi, the Economic Times, to make his presentation.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. A lot of things have been covered already. I'll just go by, the key questions which are listed out earlier for the discussion. On factors that drive and intensify US-India defense cooperation, clearly China is it, but it is. But one aspect that is there is in the past 10 years or so, especially after Doklam, it has been increasingly clear that China will be aggressive on India's borders. And to counter China, you need technology. And your traditional partner, which is Russia, does not have the technology right now to counter Chinese tech. In fact, in a lot of areas, Chinese technology has taken over Russian technology. And we need access to not just tech, but also tactics. Nobody understands the Chinese military tactics better than the Americans. They've been observing them for years. And we need that help from them as well. So that is driving the current defense cooperation agreement landscape. The second question here was that India's defense industry can it capitalize on the post-Ukraine war scenario and maybe with Americans. I think India is doing that already. We are intensifying a lot of exports. We are doing joint ventures. We are setting up new ammunition production facilities in India, 7 of them which I know, and abroad, at least 5 of them. But that's where I wanted to come to this thing that none of this is with the US. Unfortunately, India's ambition to get technology and to become an exporter is being driven and helped more by the European powers. And we have many, many examples of that. We are doing a first defense export, which is an Indo-French joint export to Armenia soon. We are setting up, I know personally, at least 3 factories coming up one in Poland and one in Estonia, I think. And so they are all coming up to manufacture ammunition and to make explosives. Look at the trade between India and France. We have $10 billion worth of deals which are going to be signed in the next 2 months for submarines and fighter jets. That's almost half of what we have combined with the Americans till now. That's just one in one visit that's going to happen. I think the ability of the Europeans to share technology with minimum restrictions or minimum administrative blocks has really helped them work their way into the Indian market. The first FDI, 100% FDI in India for defense has been set up by a Swedish company. Germans are already pitching to sell their submarines here, and they're promising to technology transfer, make India an export hub. And they say it's going to be 50% cheaper to produce in India. It's all words for now, but these words are important. On the, some issues I want to flag off on, we've heard the positives, there are a lot of positives going in. I think Samir pointed out to Indus-X, and I met you there a couple of months back. I think it's a great initiative. It's the right way to go, but it's very slow. I think it's going to take a lot of time. I don't understand, sir, like you referred to, why is the American side pushing things like the Striker onto us when it's clearly an American initiative to push it for a joint development or production.
The got carried away.
So, but it doesn't make sense. I mean, there are so many other good things to do. So a lot of energy is getting diverted into things which are not that relevant. The positives, of course, especially after Doklam, and then when the Galwan incident happened, and prior to that, I think the the kind of data sharing and intelligence sharing that the Americans have been doing, and this is all Pentagon driven, sir, which was, when Pentagon was driving the relationship, it was going much further ahead. That there has been no step back from that, thankfully.
No.
So, and that has been vital and very critical for us. I consider some of the deals that we are negotiating right now to be very, very to be big milestones. The GE 414 deal is being negotiated. I think it will be. There are a lot of last-minute haggles and problems there on particular clauses, very deep technical sharing. I mean, I think HAL is going to face a tough time. They've been given a deadline to do it in the next 6 months. I have my doubts if they will be able to do that. But the real test there is not going to be GE 414. It's India's requirement of a fifth generation fighter jet engine, the 110 kilonewton engine that we want to develop. And we have offers from the Americans, the British, and the French for that. And while I think that the preference of Indian manufacturers is to go for, our designers is to go for the American option, because it already exists on your fleet of aircraft, you know how to maintain it. But I don't think there's an offer on the table yet, which is very lucrative. In fact, the French offer is very good. They're promising full tech transfer, IPR transfer. Of course, they're asking for a lot of money, but they have a solid offer on the table. So do the Brits. They have submitted a full formal offer. I think GE can do it, but the regulations that exist within the US system, I think a lot of them are problems or impediments for really expanding the relationship to where we think we should be going. I mean, look at the kind of exercises we're doing with the Americans, more than anybody else in the world, by far. But when it comes to joint manufacturing or even co-production or development, very few good examples come to mind. I want to share with you, some things which I pick up when I talk to the Indian industry here. That's one of my areas of coverage is Indian manufacturers. When you talk to startups, so they're very happy with initiatives like the IndusX and other things. But the problem they are facing now is that they don't have still access to the deepest, shadows or silos of the American system. And they are facing hurdles in that. Some of them have spoken publicly about it. They are not getting access to research institutions. They're not getting access to some technology, which is very critical at the R&D stage. And of course, this is a lot to do with American regulations. What major Indian manufacturers, big ones who do platforms and not just technology, very few of them are happy to partner with American companies. Again, a lot to do with your regulations on clearances, but also they feel that there is not adequate technology transfer or a will to do that. I think the American defense industry does not see a big business case for India yet to be able to do that. They find much more hunger in European manufacturers to do that, and that's where they're getting more tech and more TOT. So they are gravitating more towards that side. Despite agreements, why has collaboration been minimal? I think mostly I would put it out to 2 points. One is regulatory problem in the US, but bigger than that, I think there is a lack of business case that American corporations are seeing to really invest in India and to set up hubs here, to manufacture here, export in the region. And I think India's big pitch is that we want to be an exporter of weapons. We want to be one of the top 5, and we want to be a regional manufacturer. And a Swedish company like Saab is already set up as a production facility here. They're going to export from here. With the Russians, you have the joint venture for rifles. There are many, many more examples. None of that has worked out with the US yet. The most recent example was the Airbus facility set up here with Tata. I think they are also vying for a larger order for medium transport aircraft, in which they're going to pitch against the Americans, the Lockheed Martin C-130J. One more thing I wanted to cover up was the legacy of President Biden's. I think I said definitely is his big legacy. I think there's no doubt about that. But what needs to be done ahead is we need 1 or 2 big defining deals. MQ-9B is not a defining deal. Even to pass the contract at the end, it had to go back for clearances to the government because the American side, the company, could not transfer some technology which was originally discussed, and they expressed their inability to do that. So we need a defining deal. 414 itself also is important. I hope it happens. It's a big deal, but it's not a defining deal still, because a lot of core tech is still not being shared on that. But if there is a joint production for 110 kilonewton next generation engines, or a collaboration for next generation fighters, I think those are big ticket things through which a lot of other things can flow. I think we are missing that still. Till now, most American platforms in India are purchases directly, and the government has made very clear, and I think it's part of policy. And I know for a fact that services are struggling whenever they put up a request for an import, because the first answer is always no. So it's much easier for them to procure something which is at least partially made here or made in collaboration. And some very good examples there. The Koreans have managed to sell artillery guns here because they partnered with L&T and gave them technology transfer. And we already have 100 of them. 100 more are getting manufactured. That line is going to go big. So I think there has to be a push. There has to be a business case for American companies to do the same here. I think more or less I've covered what I had to say. A lot of other things were already covered by speakers, and I think they will be. And rest for the questions.
Thank you, Manu. That was very helpful from my time point of view. And also you gave us a useful perspective with regard to Europe, that, how Europe plays into this. The Americans are, in some ways, the American companies are too big. They're so big that they often see, the kind of orders that the Indian Army would place for anything would be trivial, compared to what the US can manage, US plus its allies. See? So now I'll request Akriti Vasudeva, again from Washington, DC. She'll speak to us. Akriti.
Thank you so much, Manoj, Atul, everyone at ORF for having me, and to my co-panelists. I think Brigadier Sehgal, Samir, and Manu were really comprehensive in their remarks and touched on a lot of things that I was going to say. So I might echo and maybe emphasize some of the things that they said. Again, going through the 4 questions that you had outlined for us, but I guess I'll touch on only 3 of the questions. In terms of the drivers of the US-India defense cooperation, I do agree that the strategic alignment, particularly on Beijing's increasing assertiveness, is one of the reasons why both countries have moved forward on working and collaborating with each other, especially over the last few years. But I think some of the US concerns that perhaps Delhi can address by just better messaging is how Delhi is thinking about the military balance between the continental border versus the maritime domain, and whether investing more in border infrastructure or troop deployment there is necessarily going to result or not, moving its attention away or resources away from the border to the Indian Ocean region. This is a question that I hear in Washington, D.C. very often. So this is something I did want to bring up in discussion because it hasn't come up so far before. Another driver of the US-India defense cooperation that we haven't touched on so far, I do think, is the Indian diaspora, because there is definitely a lot of potential for the Indian diaspora to serve as a bridge between the 2 countries, especially when you think about fostering greater, innovation and joint production initiatives between both sides. So that's a factor I think we should definitely remember. Connected to that is the talented Indian population that's capable of innovation, but making sure that they are connected with US primes and customers. And some of the conversations that I've had, at least on the Indosec side, it suggests that there has been some movement on this, but it's still a problem for big companies, for small startups to talk to big companies. They don't have so much of an open mind to have a technology collaboration with startups. So Indosec has helped startups wanting to access tech from companies like Google or NVIDIA, but there's also been some access to US labs for Indian defense startups to do some testing, but you need more lab to lab or perhaps startups to startup collaboration that's needed. I think in terms of the challenge of the US-India defense cooperation, the mechanisms, one of the structural issues, I believe, and I think Brigadier Sehgal touched on this as well, is just that the R&D in the US system is private, while in India it has been mostly public. So even though both governments have really pushed the industry to collaborate, there hasn't been as much movement on the industry side as was expected under ISET. So this is something that perhaps can be addressed by more, dialogue and conversation on how you can actually break down some of these barriers. And I think Samir was talking about this too in terms of the fight between the public and private sector in India. I wanted to touch on something that I think has come up in conversation, but perhaps not outright mentioned. I do think that the Biden administration's legacy has been breaking down some of the tech and regulatory barriers in the US-India relationship. Whether that's on the jet engine co-development or the reduction in some of the export control related regulatory delays, whether that's the Mastership Repair Agreement that created some space for the US-India MRO cooperation, the NSA level dialogue with ISET, the conclusion of the MQ-9B deal. I think the bigger point here is that US officials really wanted to signal that the US is a partner of choice to India, that they were trying to do things within the system to make India a more attractive partner for the US as well. Because I think it's important to remember that there will always be voices in the US system who are used to dealing with allies and will always have the view that the US is giving away everything for free to India and for not very much benefit. So US officials, particularly in the Biden administration, have done a lot of work to kind of hold up India as an important partner in the Indo-Pacific and create buy-in in the US system for India, whether that is in terms of IndusX, but it's also outside and broadly in how things have happened in the relationship. For instance, both the US and Indian counterparts have kept each other informed of important bilateral visits and kept each other in the loop when it comes to, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war and discussions that perhaps Prime Minister Modi is having with Putin and Zelensky, etc. So I think that creates a broader environment of trust and signals to both sides that we're in this together. So I do think that is the legacy of the Biden administration. And at least in my discussions, I've seen a real desire in the US system where the idea is to take US-India defense cooperation to a level where there is Indian tech on US platforms. But the question is, how do you get there and what needs to happen to get to that point? So I'll touch a little bit on what my expectation is from the Trump administration or the future of US-India cooperation. I think the focus under Trump is going to be on maintaining deterrence. It's going to be on competition with China. But there will need to be a case made constantly, especially because of what we've seen as President-elect Trump's previous transactional approach to foreign affairs. I think US officials, with the help of Indian counterparts, they need to continue to make a case for why and how India is contributing to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, particularly vis-a-vis China, because I think that is what creates the enabling environment for US sales, tech transfers, other cooperation for India. So I think you need to sort of put more emphasis on what is it that India is doing for the US-India relationship, particularly in the Trump administration. I have some concern that with some of this transactional approach to foreign affairs, there might be a greater push towards arms sales from the new administration rather than necessarily on some of the types of cooperation that we've discussed here today. So again, I do believe that we'll have to make sure to have joint production still on the table. But broadly, I think 2023 in particular was a banner year for the US-India relationship, and so many of the mechanisms for cooperation that both sides are engaged in now would have been unheard of even 5 years ago. The amount of, even like strategic hesitations that both sides have overcome in the last few years seem, to those of us who were, tracking the foundational agreements and waited 15, 20 years for them to get operationalized, those of us who are still a little less cynical and perhaps a bit more idealistic believe that the relationship is headed in the right direction. I do take Manu's point that European partners tend to have less, administrative hurdles with regard to tech transfers or co-production and co-development. But I think the US, in at least the conversations that I've had, the US system also broadly agrees that if this technology is going to help India be a better burden sharing partner in the Indo-Pacific for the US, then it really doesn't matter where the tech or the platform comes from, as long as it's sort of part of the US alliance system. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if there are more European platforms in the Indian arsenal from the US perspective as well. I will end with that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Now we have our last speaker, Shruti Pandalai, who's from the IDFA, as I told you. Shruti.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Good afternoon, and my many thanks to ORF for having us on this very timely discussion. There's been incredible sort of anxiety, perhaps, in large regions of the Indo-Pacific on what President-elect Trump would bring to the White House, especially in terms of transactionalism to the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific is a region which I actually look at. So I think this is an opportune time, because if you are in New Delhi, you will see a quiet sort of reassurance, both in government and perhaps in strategic circles, on the ability of New Delhi to manage President-elect Trump's return to the White House. And I thought I'll sort of structure the talk today, but given the kind of expertise that we've had on this panel, to tie up some of the conversational threads that came up into how we'd be looking at this defense cooperation, given the questions you have sort of posed to us going forward. I think when we talk about trajectories and prospects of India-US defense cooperation, it ultimately comes down to, as many of us have discussed in the last 1 hour, to the value and utility that both sides place in each other in terms of their respective strategic calculus, and the enduring, if you will, buy-in into the fundamental value of the partnership across political cycles, bureaucratic, technology, and defense industry ecosystems, which therefore brings you to the immediate sort of conversation on President-elect Trump return to the White House and what it means for our partnership. Like I said, I think there's a certain quiet reassurance in New Delhi about its ability to manage the incoming administration, and I think there are two apparent reasons for that. One remains that a lot of the nominees, the top nominees that have been announced by the incoming Trump administration, have known to be, I wouldn't call it friends of India, but staunchly in favor of a stronger India-US partnership. The second is, I think, our experience with Trump 1.0, a lot has been discussed, but I think there was a significant evidence to prove that whether it was defense, counterterrorism, regional security, whether it was the foundational agreements that allowed for interoperability to be increased between US Indian forces, including the revival of the Quad, all happened under Trump 1.0. Which also then led to the operationalization of the Quad, which has become the fundamental anchor for what India does and thinks of bringing value to the Indo-Pacific, more functional. In fact, a lot of the foundational documents under Trump 1.0, whether it is, when they talk about the need for a strong India or to support and accelerate India's rise, especially in its role as a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region and the larger Indo-Pacific, tells you that perhaps India will feature more prominently going forward. And so we expect more continuity, like how the other speakers have outlined. While, we can get to the challenges of Trump 2.0 in terms of anxieties over his non-hesitation into sort of tearing up existing strategic alignments or lines of cooperation, I think there is a reassurance in Delhi that muscle memory will kick in. And, at the end of the day, President Trump and elect Trump and his personality type can be moved, meaning that there is reasoning will exist as long as you're able to convince him of the better deal going to the United States in pursuit of shared strategic interests. So I think, like Samir, Akriti, Manu all mentioned that, there's been this understanding is also reflective of the work done by administrations on both sides of the aisle for over 20, 25 years. I was recently moderating a panel on the Quad, and a senior US State Department official who's been working on India and South Asia talked about the transformation and the quality of the relationship. And he said in the past, US-India relationships, were constantly in the news because of the bumps. Now we have learned that, we are no longer defined by the bumps. And I thought that was important point given, how much he's been in the news, especially on the news around Bangladesh, for it to come from him. And I think there is, it goes back to what the foreign minister often talks about. And he says that, there is a structural soundness in the India-US relationship. And even in MEA, when you speak to senior officials who are handling the American portfolio, they talk about, that New Delhi doesn't work with red or blue. It works with systems, and these systems speak more, they engage more. And while they may not agree on everything, they find a way to actualize the so-called habits of cooperation. So all of this generally leads to the buy-in on the strategic logic of the relationship. I think all of us have talked about the convergence on the China challenge, the need to create a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. But it's also the ability or the idea that all countries have to work together to impose cost, not just talk in terms of rhetoric on Chinese unilateralism in the Indo-Pacific. But more fundamentally, from India's point of view, I think the US plays a very crucial role in Prime Minister Modi's vision for India's transformation. And I mean it both in the economic and as well as the security realm. Whether it's Make in India, it's Digital India, Prime Minister Modi has often emphasized that, for India and the US, there's a fundamental stake in each other's success. Everyone's discussed the ISET. People have, there's conversation on IndiaX, frameworks being developed by the SOSA, or to working on the RDP and, to facilitate this defense industrial base we're talking about. I think the idea is that the transformation of India is essential, not just to ensure capacity and supply chain resilience, but also help India reduce these arms dependencies and have autonomy in its strategic decision making. And all of these have been built up incrementally. Because at the end of the day, if India wants to be the preferred security partner in the Indian Ocean region and needs to burden share increasingly in the Indo-Pacific, these capacities have to be built up. And so whether it's exercises, whether it's, more and more interoperable capacities and capabilities being built up, defense trade, including what a lot of folks have been talking about, sharing of intelligence. A lot of this work has been actually transformationally done over the last 10 to 14 years. But if you talk to most folks in New Delhi, what has been the most transformative quality of the relationship, it's, of course, the legacy of the Biden relationship, and the work done under the Strategic Technology Partnership will be the poster child of what Indians remember as the fundamental transformation in the US relationship. But this also comes into focus primarily in the theater where India is focused at the moment and finds maximum convergence with the United States, and that's in the Indo-Pacific. A lot of the strategic sort of technology partnership today has been pivoted into the Indo-Pacific because now you look at most, facets of US-India cooperation, including defense, maritime domain awareness, and critical infrastructure, all revolve around this strategic technology partnership. So this has become sort of an important piece where both sides, of course, talk about the China challenge and the need to manage the China challenge. But you see increasingly more and more doctrinally aligned, where they highlight each other's values in managing these emerging challenges, including assertive action by China, but to more tangible efforts to establish Indo-Pacific coordination and cooperation, which directly then goes into bilateral relations. There's also everyone spoke of the Quad. There is increasingly a preference to look at bilateral agendas, 2+2 agendas, and find congruence to a lot of work that is done on the Quad. And how that work then translates into various wings of this lattice work that the US talks about in the Indo-Pacific in terms of preferred partners, whether it's the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, where you see a lot of alignments, or the East Asia Summit, if you will, on approaches, strategies, and policies, whether in various geographies, from Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and now including the Pacific. So I think one of the biggest advantages that have come under the Biden administration, especially in US-India defense cooperation related to the Indo-Pacific, has been the redefining of security, both in the economic and the strategic realm, as a provision of public good, which therefore takes away, sort of kills the idea of an Asian NATO, which the Chinese are propagating. So I think that redefining has been a substantial contribution. Now, I've argued in my work previously that if you're looking at, what the benefits or the tangible deliverables from the Quad have been, even in terms of a security cooperation mandate, it does not have an explicit security cooperation mandate, because its practitioners would argue that it's not a public mandate, it's public mandate to have one. But to dismiss the incremental sort of build-up of security cooperation within the Quad just as political signaling is also disingenuous, because I think what is happening quietly and more effectively is these very habits of cooperation or lines of effort which are trying to build the resilience to deter, which is quite frankly more acceptable to large geographies of the Indo-Pacific, rather than taking on China in a more confrontational manner. One could argue whether it's the training programs which build on the 2+2 platforms of all of the Quad countries, initiatives like IndusX and ISET, the logistic agreements, the refueling agreements, the expanded joint military exercises, all have helped synergizing the ecosystem. So apart from, if you, I think Samir discussed the Malabar, but if you really look down to what they're trying to achieve, whether it's advanced tactical training, strengthening of the MDA, joint operational planning, and foster deeper understanding of each nation's sort of naval doctrines and operational procedures, all of that is going on. The second aspect, which is often pushed off as, the software, it's the lighter part of what's happening under the guise of defense cooperation. But I do think it's a valuable part, is the resilience, the ability of India-US bilateral relationship, working with its partners in the Quad to build sort of resilience against maritime breaches. What has come out of the last two Quad sort of meetings has been specific outcomes linked to addressing gray zone tactics revolving around maritime blind spots. I think Samir mentioned the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, which is becoming increasingly required at a time of increasing Chinese belligerence, where they're trying to create new normals in the South China Sea, and has also established for us more threateningly more permanent presence in the Indian Ocean. So integrating more advanced satellite systems, maritime surveillance technologies, improving real-time monitoring of threats and coordination of responses is the need of the hour. You also have the Quad Coast Guard initiative, which is, has been debated highly as to what its scope will be. But I think there is expanding on all of these linkages. The maritime legal dialogue, I feel, is also extremely important because everyone talks about the UNCLOS and, how China is now inching towards a 2026 sort of closing in on the code of conduct negotiations. I think, you need to sort of see that, if you're building the socialization of the UNCLOS, increasing this knowledge sharing to push back, these are areas where actually India could do more and has done more, whether with the ASEAN-India military sort of exchange or what it's been doing in the neighborhood. So while all of this work has been done, I think it was Vikram J. Singh, who's also at USIP, but he said something during one of our conversations on another panel where he says that the scope of India-US cooperation is not limitless, but needs to be managed. And I think that's very true. A lot of us have spoken about the tempering of expectations, sensitivities, and perceptions. And I think that needs to be increasingly done in the public square. We all heard about oft-repeated complaints on export controls, procedural delays, regulatory obstacles, etc., which needs to be managed better, both by institutional, legal, and monetary reforms on both sides of the aisle. But perhaps it's important to remember from in Washington that in New Delhi, the yardstick of success of defense cooperation, at least where I work and what the conversations I listen to, is often based on the sharing of high-end technologies, whether you like it or not. The idea remains that Washington has often demonstrated this exceptionalism in the case of India. So perhaps a more open conversation, at least in the public square, that if India is indeed a trusted partner, is there scope of bilateral agreements, or do they already exist which are specifically designed to expedite and simplify the licensing process for these technologies? Could we have a conversation on that? To many, many irritants, often President-elect Trump is coming back to the White House. What will happen to India and the CATSA? Now, this is a conversation that constantly creates the cycle of speculation and has the ability to derail this relationship. I think that's something that we'll have to think about. Finally, to sort of end with some of the points that Brigadier Sehgal mentioned, which is related to China, that we all say that we might be like-minded on the China challenge, but we are not same-minded. And I think that is very important to understand, because while the larger convergence on the China challenge remains, the means and the ends might differ. And I think this is particularly important because of India's sensitivities, whether it's to what, and managing the expectations. Somebody spoke about the Taiwan contingency. I think it's also equally legitimate perception on the Quad, because there's a constant conversation that how will India approach the Quad in case there's a push for more sort of a military, harder edge to the Quad more explicitly. I think these conversations need to be addressed in the public square far more, and we need a constant dialogue on strategic divergences, especially on the issue of Russia. No matter how much we say that the sort of relationship is insulated from a lot of these issues in the behind closed doors and diplomatic circles, I think the public square does more damage than good to the India-US relationship. I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
I think we've had our presenters give us various aspects of the issue. I think we can see clearly that the India-US defense cooperation, there are very clearly two aspects to it. One is the political aspects, the political aspects of our Indo-Pacific strategy, our Look East strategy, our multipolar perspective. So there is the political aspect of it. And the second is, of course, the technology aspect. And the technology aspect is a very old aspiration of India, meaning right since independence, India has always kind of hankered to be technologically independent, and it's all linked to its self-perception as a nation. When we come to the China challenge, it is more complex, meaning at the political level, yes, there is a China challenge. But at the technology level, there is a certain amount of ambivalence. And the reason for the ambivalence is, and you can see the figures of Indian imports from China are booming. Why are they booming? A lot of technology, assemblies, sub-assemblies coming in, because India wants to trigger its own manufacturing revolution. So one is the defense aspect of it, where we may want to keep the Chinese out. But the second level is the Chinese technology is something which we consider useful. And I think this was referred to in our economic survey this year. Recently, our Niti Aayog CEO even said that India should maybe sign the RCEP. So India had refused to sign the RCEP at one point. So what I'm trying to get at is that China is a complex challenge. It's not a simple, meaning one aspect of the challenge is the military challenge and the potential military challenge. But the second aspect is our global perspective. And part of our global perspective is, I think we are very clear that we want to be we want a multipolar world. And we want to be one of the poles of that multipolar world, and which automatically means that we do not want to be like other American allies. We don't want to be a military ally of the United States. We want to be a military partner. Partnership is different from an alliance. And the US has to also navigate that as well, meaning the US is not used to a country like India, meaning all the rest of the countries, they are the big boss, meaning they are they run the alliance. They are also the security guarantors of countries like Germany, France, UK, Japan. But in our case, we don't want the US as security guarantors. We can take care of our security. So it's a different kind of a relationship. And so it will have a different contours from what I can see. In any case, now we have a short while, maybe 15 minutes. We can take questions from the floor. And then I'll ask the speakers to respond.
Yeah, I couldn't actually get what Samir was saying because of either the acoustics or some problem. But, I just want to talk about one very basic issue that has emerged, and nobody has used that word unless I missed it. We've talked about, I'm talking about India, US, and that is trust. Now, is there 100% trust between India and the US? And trust is a commodity that doesn't come easily, even amongst the Brits, special relationship, etc., we have problems with them. I met a British journalist 2 years ago in London, and this was the time, I think, Prime Minister Modi had just come back. And after signing those very elaborate agreements with the Americans, and as we now discover, none of them has actually materialized, and we are talking about structural issues, we are talking about impediments of regulation. I mean, this is all very well. It is, in my judgment, lack of trust. We do not fully trust each other. The Defense Secretary last year at an IDEX conference, Girdhar Armane, publicly and unprecedentedly called the Chinese a bully. And he said in this IDEX conference that the Chinese are bullying us, and will the Americans come and help us? So that is the fundamental question, whether whether we will help them when it comes to Taiwan? No. Whether they will come to help us if the Cold War gets hot on the LAC? No. So we are not allies. So I think that is the suspicion, and this British journalist actually quoted a number of issues on which this doubt has arisen, and the way we handle our foreign policy, this strategic autonomy and multi-alignment, this gives a certain sense of ambivalence about our permanence. Yeah. So I just want somebody to address this question. Is there 100% trust between India and the US?
My name is Pawan. My question is pertaining to the talk which all the speakers have in fact tried to put across, but nobody has in fact thought about the US-Pakistan relationship, because this is a triangle, and Pakistan-US relations plays a very important role in the triad. That is number one. Second thing is that when it comes to the technology transfer, what the experience has been that US companies or US government only transfer the technologies which are, at least if they are not recent, they are old technologies. For example, the Predator which they are giving, Predator drones, I think 6-7 years earlier they were being used in Afghanistan, right? Now coming to your fact tapping of satellite phones or listening to the satellite phones for our security agencies, have they transferred the technology to us? They have not transferred to Pakistan, they have not transferred to India also. That is where the question is. Can somebody answer this?
Rahul?
Question is for Dr. Lalwani. I'm Rahul, focusing on national security issues at ORF. I'll take from what Mr. Manu Pabi highlighted. You and Dr. Lalwani has done a good piece on intersects and achievements and whatnot. The American side is very keen on picking some of the ideas related to low tech kind of initiatives from Indian ecosystem and develop on that. But what, in your view, are some of the obstacles and challenges in the U.S. defense ecosystem when it comes to giving access to the Indian partners? Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Harsh Thakur. I'm from Hindu College. A couple of questions here. Firstly, one point to make that, like Sir said, Americans would prefer to have India as dependent partner of them rather to have India as an independent partner in the situation. So in May, they had created this kind of mini-lateral with the Philippines. So where are we looking at the situation of Squad, as they dubbed it, with regards to Quad? And second question is about India's fighter capacity. We are already looking at the figures. It is below the 1965 levels. The G engines have been delayed because, well, they have said it's the war, it's a conflict, they are not giving the engines. India has even invoked the penalty clause, but the engines are not coming in. That is where the Tejas Mark 1s are delayed. Then we're also looking at the situation where the Russians cannot upgrade the engines as per the Indian requirements. And the SOSA happens to be a non-binding arrangement. So again, that is where Americans can conveniently say that, okay, we are committed at this place and we are not committed at this place. So then the question comes is, how is India going to wrap up that lacuna which exists with regards to the fighters? Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Shresh Sharma, and my question is directed towards Mr. Pabi. He mentioned that US has shown hesitation, and it has been rather unable to set up defense manufacturing facilities within India, like Russia did in case with the AKs, and it has been seen as a sign of our strong relations with the Russian partnership, at least publicly. What do you think is holding back the US from manufacturing such things in India? And do you think this will change anytime in future? Thank you.
I'm from Manipur. Just one important serious question that I want to raise. Recently, in Manipur conflict, drones were being used by the non-state actors during the conflict, and very recently also the satellite internet are being seized, and that Elon Musk has responded that that satellite beams are turned off in India, and most probably no, I'm sure that it is turned on in Bangladesh. And how do you see with this particular development? And this Elon Musk has been one of the most closest to Trump. So.
No, I think the question of keeping the channels of communication open to ensure strategic trust is vital. I think that conversation is going, but the fundamentals are right, so I think we'll work on it. On the question of Squad versus Quad, I think the idea of what India wants out of the Quad is very clear. So whether it's Squad, whether it's AUKUS, we look at it as efforts that are non-binding for us. So we have a very clear approach to security cooperation as we look at it in the Indo-Pacific. So we're quite happy as long as we're kept in the loop as to what is happening in other platforms. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Akriti?
Yes, thanks, Manoj. I'll just respond to the question on US-India trust or lack thereof. I was in Delhi last month. I was at ORF. Had a good discussion with you all. But in general, I think you always hear in the US-India relationship, the concern from Delhi, or the episodes that are brought up are always, US arms embargo against India in 1965, US sending, USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal in 1971. But I think, recent instances of US support to India are disregarded and maybe not seen as important or critical in what the relationship means today. So, for example, the US support and very active diplomatic support and help to India in getting into the missile technology control regime, into the Wassenaar Agreement, the US actually helping to block a discussion that India did not want to happen on the Kashmir issue at the UN, These are all issues that India cares about, and the US has actually spent a lot of resources in trying to assure to India that it is an important and strategic partner to Delhi. So I understand, and I do agree with what Shruti said there. These channels of communication should definitely be open, especially with what has been happening in the US-India relationship in the last few months, especially going into the Trump administration, with the Panu investigation, etc. But I do think that perhaps there needs to be more recognition of how much the US and India have actually done together and walked this path in the last few years, which makes for a positive relationship going forward.
A few things. So on trust, I don't think anyone can trust completely, but we have built up on trust. I think the only trust that we can have is on that each country will act for their own best benefit. On the LAC question, sir, I think we are in a state right now where the Americans won't come with troops or troops on the ground, but the most important part of warfare, which is targeting information, intelligence, coordinates. I think we're at a stage where the Americans may be helping us out if something blows up on the LAC. I'm saying this because what they've done earlier with intelligence sharing on when the whole Galwan incidents happened, Yangtze also. On Pakistan, US, why has it not been talked about? I think because increasingly Pakistan is becoming a Chinese vassal state, and it's bad for us. Till the time US had some influence on Pakistan, we had a lever to play. We don't have that anymore. I think it's going to get more and more there. On old technology being shared with the US, yes, they are sharing old technology, but that's fine. We need some of them very basic tech, which is old for the Americans is good enough for us. Of course, if there was a game changer, offer to make or supply the F-35s here, which is very high end, that would make a difference. Fighters, we're in a very bad state. The chief has said, and I agree with him, we are lacking. We need to have another production line. I hope the MRFA program goes through. It's still not got final clearances. On reluctance of US manufacturers holding back on India, I see it's purely, from my understanding, as a business case. And I'll give you a very small example. This was a big Indian company. They were participating in an Indian Army tender. I think, if I remember, it was about 7,000 crores. They wanted a US partner. And the Americans took so much time in coming back to them on specific questions. Like one question on, can you share this technology? They came back in 3 months. And you just can't work on a procurement cycle like that. So I think it's just a lack of business cases that American companies see which are holding them back from coming here.
Yeah, let me see if I can relate the trust question to something that was posed to me, which is, I think you can always trust business to find opportunities when they see value in them. So this is related to Manu's point. The number one obstacle to the sort of US sort of playing a larger role in the Indian defense ecosystem, whether it's in production, technology, collaboration, et cetera, is literally the phrase I've heard, a book of orders, right? You put a book of orders on the table, business will come. The F-35 program built a huge production facility in Italy because Italy put $1 billion on the table for it. So this is a challenge, right, for the Indian government to say, can it find the resources, whether it's through procurement through the services, procurement through Defense Acquisition Council, to put that sort of book of orders on the table. I mean, the MQ-9 deal was offered in the previous Trump administration. Thankfully, it has been signed just before the next Trump administration comes in. But if they had showed up in 2025 and realized the deal still hadn't been done, they'd be pretty upset. So it's the length of time it takes, the value of the book of orders to put on the table, the acquisition procedures, and then also I'd add another point about Indian bandwidth. Right, this is a challenge I see routinely within the Indian system, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of External Affairs. It's not that you don't have talent, tremendous talent, just not enough throughput. You need more of it. You need to sort of have more staffing at all these levels. If you want to be moving international deals, not everything can go through the Prime Minister's office, right? That is a choke point for all decision processes. Our system, including sort of not just in the public sector, but in the bureaucracy, but also in the companies, is like a lot more diffuse and dispersed decision-making. And that allows for sort of a greater volume of transactions, which the volume of transactions builds trust over time. No one builds trust by sort of just saying things on paper. Like the repeat interaction and transactions is the foundation for trust, whether that transaction is monetary or strategic. So the only way you get there is you have dispersed decision-making with a routine amount of interactions going on between partners. questions I get from the U.S. industry routinely. They're like, who's engaging with us? There's always an expectation that this has to go to the prime minister's office, but the Indian embassies and consulates can be the outreach vehicles to industry, to venture capital, and frankly, this is what India's competitors are doing. The Israelis and the British, who are seeking investments for their startups, for their defense partnerships, for defense manufacturing, they go out and they meet these folks individually and court them. There's not a similar venture happening within sort of the ministries, consulates, and embassies at the same level. They don't have the same game. Maybe that's a bandwidth issue. Maybe that's sort of a focal area issue. But I think bandwidth and I think a book of orders and sort of committed buys, when you see those put on the table, you see big things move, right? The commitment of a buy for GE engines is what's driving that process. In the absence of that, in the abstract, that, hey, come just build, technology on our soil and then export it, that's not lucrative enough. So trust that business will find the opportunities when the incentive structure are placed in the right order.
Couple of points, please. I agree with what Samir has said about trust. I mean, you have to build trust. You have to create the equities for trust, and until unless you do that. But the issue, basically, from Indian perspective, is that we sometimes find that the American is too big. They have too many multifarious interests. That their attention spans are limited. And when the attention spans are limited, and it also depends upon how relevant the issue is. How do you place? I mean, a lot of being talked about, number of issues being taken place in Quad, and a lot of initiatives being taken with public goods issues, etc. But at the end of it is what is being delivered. The point at issue is what is being. Are we getting security? Aspects out of this relationship. What is it that we are getting? So we need to be very clear about the trust for Indian perspective. From our perspective, basically, is how does this relationship addresses my challenges in which I am investing in. Please understand, as far as India is concerned, as of now, India has done about $25 billion worth of investment in weapon systems. We have not done a single paisa of investment in technology so far. We will be doing moment we get to G414. To me, G414 is a commitment from both sides to push a particular direction of building up capacities and capabilities between two strategic partners. To me, that is trust. That is important part. My second point is we have to also understand a lot of discourses and discussions take place in these dialogues. My humble point to everybody is try and go and research how much is deliverables. Maritime Domain Initiative is an issue which is talked about. There is no Maritime Domain Initiative ever coverage in Indian Ocean region. We have to understand that. There is no coverage. We get MDI only from Malacca eastwards. There is nothing over here. There are no facilities, no capacities Americans have or anybody else of the allies have. Please understand these things. You just don't get carried away by some statements being made during dialogue processes. We do that. But the question is, we must understand what is being delivered to you at the end of the day. IDEX, innovation, true, good, everything is happening. But how much of the innovative work is being picked up by American interests who are very smart enough? They have a team in Delhi led by a 3-star general who comes to Delhi, India, who scouts around for innovative strategies, buys them on the road and takes them to the United States and build up the capacities over there. It's not Americans' fault. It's our fault. What are we doing with those innovatives? How much are we investing them? How are we supplying credit to our guys? Joke is, 18 crore project, I'll give you 3 crores as a this thing. I'll put 10% of the 3 crores. And what happens to you as a balance? 15 crores is your money. You put 15 crores, 10% into the project. He says, how the hell am I going to put that much of money? I'm a startup. So there are a lot of issues that we need to look at in-house before we start blaming anybody else. There are a lot of issues on these. defense ministry in India continues to be process driven. They are process oriented. They have these acquisition booklets, this thing, etc., but they do not understand how the industry works. As far as our private sector is concerned, they are not holy grail either. Those guys are also investing in projects which get them profits. Okay, so they are not going to go in for any kind of all profits. So we have to need to temper with our aspirations, need to work out via medias amongst ourselves, particularly amongst our industries, and ensure that credibility of our aspirations of being Atmanirbhar are met in a fashion that both sides can be managed. Okay, Americans have set up factories in Hyderabad, right? GE has got, Boeing has got, a couple of other people have got. What are they? They're part of supply chains, but they're not your supply chains. They're American supply chains, sirs. How are you going to do with your supply chains? How are you going to get those supply chains for your items? That's something which we need to think through. Thank you.
So it's my duty now to thank all of you. Just like to make two comments. One is that when you say old technology, please understand what is the state of your own technology level, meaning your own manufacturing, your own technology level. You cannot absorb it, you see. Number two, I think, General Saab, the word trust, I will just only quote you an old American president. He said, trust but verify. That is Ronald Reagan. So always trust but verify. So that is his slogan, and I think we should follow it. This thing. So now, please give a hand to all our participants. Thank you very much. Thank you, our participants from Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here with us. So now I'd like to invite you for tea next door.